of all, I'd like to tag into Peter's introduction. Really appreciate it. Old, I am getting there. Experienced, not yet. Guy, not quite, but nevertheless, thank you so much for including Greg Summers, my co-author, and myself in your program. And we would be remiss if we didn't take a moment to thank Peter, Andy, George, and their respective organizations for hosting such a wonderful conference this time. So forecasting. We actually, in our paper, we do some of the thinking before you actually get to the forecasting stage. And what we really did, we started with thinking about, it actually came from Stephen and Duran's graph in their 2001 ratio analysis paper in RAST, where you may all be familiar with the graph. They looked at RNOA over 5 years and looked for mean reversion. And they saw that it typically collapsed within about 3 years to a very tight range. And so Greg and I started thinking about what possible factors might a company possess to prevent that mean reversion and profitability from occurring. And so we started by scouring the economics literature, the strategic management literature, even went into marketing world a little bit, and tried to gather some attributes or some variables, some constructs that we thought might work for determining what kind of company might have elevated and persistently elevated profitability over time. So we found quite a plethora of candidates, and we decided to really back up and call this type of construct a competitive advantage. At first we were calling it a barrier to entry, and then we found some variables that just didn't quite fit that. So competitive advantage, we use that term about 800 times in our paper. We would love a slicker name for it, but that's about the best that we can think of at the time. And what we do then is we use these competitive advantage variables, looking at future profitability, and kind of work backwards to say, okay, this is what the literature proposes in these other fields. They've not really studied these variables empirically. They have more or less just done analytical research in these other fields, and or they've studied a single industry. When we as researchers bring these things together in a large-scale sample, what pops? And we use these ex post realizations of higher profitability to kind of back into what works and what's generalizable across all industries, across all firms, across all time periods. Okay, so who should care, right? This is the important question that we should answer. Well, first of all, managers should care, because most of these things, most of these characteristics require some sort of expenditure of effort or funds. Some of them are potentially sort of innate characteristics that are part of the underlying business model. We try and control for that. But a lot of them are actually choice variables that managers have to allocate those scarce resources, as Keith talked about earlier today. So managers should hopefully take something from our research. If you're advertising beyond that of your industry peers, you may not be getting the bang for the buck that you think that you are. And of course, we would like to think that from an analysis context, this has a lot of implications, because if you can determine that a particular economic characteristic is going to prevent mean reversion of profitability, that's going to affect your growth rates that you use in your model, and certainly may affect where your forecast horizon, how far out you need to forecast. Okay, so these competitive advantages, what do we start with? What do we find? We sort of start with the traditional suspects, if you will, and these are pretty much more the barrier to entry kind of candidates, economies of scale. And I'll take this moment to just briefly define how we formulate these metrics in our paper. We use basically all of the fundamental accounting ratio analysis that we all teach, that we all talk about, but surprisingly, a lot of people outside of our area of accounting don't necessarily map the ratios that we think about into these constructs. So economies of scale, we use a cost of goods sold ratio, really trying to get at the idea of, okay, how can you build economies of scale? You can sell the same amount, but decrease your costs, or you can sell more, holding your costs constant. Product differentiation, typical advertising intensity. So your advertising expense scaled by net sales. Innovation, that's the sum of R&D expense and your patent amortization expense, again, scaled by net sales. And capital requirements, we use depreciation expense scaled by sales to get more at a capital maintenance rather than a capital expenditure kind of construct. So those are pretty straightforward. we would expect, we would hope, that we would get a positive association with profitability on all except for economies of scale. The way we've constructed it, we're going to look for a negative there because we want to hold the costs down. However, with capital requirements, some of the past research has found a negative relation between profitability and capital requirements. And we have come up with the idea that if there's any excess capacity built into your capital, that could lead actually to a negative relation. And that is indeed what we find as well. So the expanded column, we actually started with Porter. And so I'm a big fan of Porter's work, and I've asked a lot of my colleagues, and Greg has done the same, you know, how come you don't actually operationalize Porter in your work when you're doing strategic management kind of research? And they tell us, well, we'd love to, it's great in theory, but we don't know how to operationalize it. And so we, of course, as accountants, say we've got a way. We've got several ratios that should fit the bill. So power over suppliers is the first element that we look at. And we actually measure it two ways. One, using the operating liability leverage that's from Stephen's book, which basically is operating liabilities divided by net operating assets. And we are trying to speak to some trade credit theory here, particularly the quality guarantee theory from Smith, where the idea is if you have a longer period of time to inspect your goods, you can actually return them. You can then search for a new supplier if you're not pleased with the goods that you're purchasing. And so the operating liability leverage, the leaning on the trade, if you will, sort of maps into that nicely. We also look at inventory turnover, which speaks to some transaction theory from trade credit that says, all right, if you're a supplier, you would like to minimize the amounts of time that you have to transact with your customer because transaction costs are costly. So you would like to consolidate their orders, serve them the same quantity of sales and goods, but in fewer transactions. So the opposite of that, if you have power over your suppliers, you have more control over the order quantity and the credit terms and the number of times that you approach your supplier. So we believe that that's actually going to have a negative relation for the firm. They're going to have more power over their suppliers when they transact more often. But then power over customers, the next variable, now we are sort of agnostic. We take the opposite extreme. We say, okay, well, let's look at the accounts receivable turnover. Okay, it's the opposite then of the inventory turnover. And we're going to say, if you have to transact with us a lot, customer, that may indicate that there are no other substitutes for our product, and we're the only game in town. Now, it would be hard for both the inventory turnover to work and the accounts receivable turnover to work for each firm, right? Because you're sort of taking opposite sides of the coin. And that's something that we want to actually expand this paper and look at differences in those cycle times. That's something that we'd like to do next. And then we also look at market share for power over customers with the idea that if you're the dominant player, there must be fewer players in town, and you have more control over your customers. And then the final category we call credible threat of expected retaliation, again from Porter's work. And this is the idea that if you're going to come and play in our town, if we have a lot of financial resources, you're less apt to pick the fight with us. Okay? So we measure this two ways. First of all, we'll preempt your entry if we have a lot of borrowing capacity. Because if we have a lot of credit available to us, we can then deter you coming in to compete against us because we can engage you in price wars, we can expand our market, we can basically price you out of the business. And the second variable is this idea of net financial assets, again from Stephen's work, rather than net financial obligations. If I'm a company that has net financial assets, they're fairly liquid, I can convert them to cash as needed, it's sort of my own piggy bank. So we either say the degree of your net financial assets, or if you have net financial obligations, we set that to 0. So those are our variables. Our main profitability metric is RNOA, which I'll talk about shortly. I think we're all familiar with it. We adjust for risk. So this is sort of an innovation in this type of research. I think it's very important if you're going to talk about across industry, within industry, over time, you have to adjust for risk, or else any lack of mean reversion that you're seeing may just be differences in risk across firms. And we also do an industry adjustment. So because industries have different business models, different levels of capital requirements, you can imagine that you need different capital requirements if you're Boeing versus if you're Starbucks, right? We need to mean adjust everything within industries to make sure that we're taking out those differences across industries. And we look at 2 time horizons, 1 and 5 years. Okay, so I won't make you wait for the results. It turns out that the traditional variables really don't get you much action. They're pretty much just, they're there. They don't necessarily hurt you, but you get the biggest bang for the buck from your power over suppliers. Specifically, the operating liability leverage is a really good predictor of accelerated and elevated future profitability. The bargaining power over customers gives you some modest gains, and also the credible threat from expected retaliation, specifically the FLEV, the leverage variable, the borrowing capacity, and the net financial assets. Okay, so we use RNOA, obviously, because we want to abstract away from the effect of leverage, right? We want to focus on operations. And for our risk adjustment, we actually, let me just get right to the model. We actually use Easton and Summers 2007 as our starting point. And this is the paper where Peter and Greg basically are simultaneously estimating R and G. This is a residual income framework. And what we do is we expand it back to the enterprise level, and we focus on the operating components. And again, simultaneously estimate R and G, but this time we end up with the cost of operations rather than the cost of equity capital. And so once we have this number, we basically estimate these in portfolios based on quintiles of market to book and quintiles of size. So each year there's 25 portfolios of the cost of operations, and that's what we use to then adjust RNOA. So just to give you some summary statistics about that adjustment, we start with the RNOA, a median RNOA of 10.4%, and after the risk adjustment, we get down to 3.3, which gives us an implied cost of operations of about 7.1%. Okay, in the industry adjustment, we basically just start with the Fama-French 48 classifications, just subtract off the median for the dependent variable and the independent variables, and that way everything is done within the industry. So all of our analyses from that point are saying, all right, are you advertising greater than your peers in your industry, less than, or at about that same level, and so on for the other variables. Okay, so once we do all of our adjustments, the median RNOA, as we said, is 3.3. Just to kind of give you what we find industry by industry, and in the paper, there's a lot of descriptive statistics by industry in case anyone's interested. But we can see tobacco, top earner. George does all right with his printing company, apparently, right? Publishing company, 5.8. Consumer goods. And the lowest RNOA tends to be the commodities-based industries and very high-tech, kind of medical tech type companies as well. So we basically have 2 frameworks that we use. One is a typical regression model where we're looking at 1 year ahead and 5 year ahead profitability, and we're trying to look at increases in explanatory power from adding these additional variables that are competitive advantages. We basically run both a levels and a changes model in the paper, get fairly consistent results using each type of model. We do include 2 control variables. First of all, age, because if you believe that firms learn as they go and there's some benefit to experience, you need to control for age to make sure that the increases in profitability are not just due to doing whatever it is that you do for a longer period of time. And size, and we weren't quite sure how that would factor into our model, because you could either be a dominant player and the size would help your profitability, or if you become too large, you become sort of bureaucratic and you're unable to move with competitive forces, and it could be a negative. So we didn't really know how that would affect profitability ex ante. So beyond that base model, we have then 3 separate specifications that we run, and I'm going to mainly discuss the last one, but just to kind of show you how we build upon the base model. The traditional incorporates the barrier to entry type variables. The expanded then adds the Porter-esque variables, power over suppliers, power over customers, and the credible threat. And then we have a fourth model, which includes not only the levels, but the changes for all of the above variables, because we wanted to capture the idea that maybe there's some of these variables that you can't just continue to increase without bound. Maybe at some point, there's too much of a good thing, and if we see an opposite sign than expected in the change variable, that tells us that there's diminishing returns to continuing to invest in that particular attribute. Okay, so T+1, T+5, we run both horizons, and I think the best number to focus on is, there it is right there. This number right here, that shows us that over the base model, that final model, the diminishing returns model, gives us a 32% increase in adjusted R-squared at T+1. And the further out we go, when we go to T+5, we get even a better performing model by adding those additional variables. And you can see incrementally the increase for adding each set of variables. Okay, so what do we find? I'm just going to kind of focus on the T+1. The T+5 is substantially similar. We find that the economies of scale actually pops very nicely, but that's the only of the traditional variables that gives you sustained elevated profitability. And then the operating liability leverage, the power over suppliers, is really important, along with inventory turn, but only the change. So it doesn't matter how many inventory turns you have now, those transactions with your suppliers, but if you can increase those transactions with your suppliers, that should be indicative of higher future profitability. Similarly, the transactions with your customers. So the next step that we'd like to do is sort of look at that more contextually, operating cycle, put them together, kind of find out, maybe with a composite score, are those firms that are simultaneously actually being able to increase both of those cycles, or is it one versus the other? So that's the next step that we'll be pursuing in this paper. And then excess funds, and those are the net financial assets, of course, seem to serve as a good deterrent. Okay, and the last part that I'm going to be talking about before we go to questions, I'm just going to show you a few of these convergence graphs, which basically says, all right, let's actually study profitability 5 years over time by conditioning on the level of each conditioning variable. So economies of scale, for example, well, actually, let me show you the baseline. This is basically just sorting into RNOA portfolios, quintiles first, following RNOA out 5 years. And we can see that, all right, our sample is consistent with prior research. We can see that convergence does take place. For sure, by 3 years, it's converged to a pretty tight range of about 4% difference. And this is already the risk and industry adjusted. So the median is 3.3. So there's still some difference to play with. Now we want to try and explain how you can actually account for some of those differences with the individual variables. So economies of scale, it starts out, you do have some spread at year 0 when you sort into your 5 quintiles for economies of scale. And it does collapse over time as well. It does follow the kind of general pattern, but you still have almost a 1% difference at the end of 5 years. So there you get some play, but not a whole lot. Advertising is disappointing, right? And one thing that we'll just mention is it is so important to industry and risk adjust. Because when you don't, advertising actually shows a differential at the end of 5 years of about 5%. So a lot of people, they use those kinds of results to say, yep, advertising's great. But if you are advertising more than your industry peers, you may not be reaping the benefit yourself. You may be growing the general demand for what it is that you produce, but your competitors are able to come in and free ride on those efforts. Innovation, it's a little bit disappointing as well. So this is the R&D. Interestingly enough, the highest return are the firms that just sort of are the median amounts of R&D. So if you're just innovating at sort of the industry median, you're good. But as soon as you innovate too much more than that, you actually are going to have far lower returns, about 1.3%, even after 5 years. Capital intensity, we find it's a reverse monotonic. Basically, the more you have of capital requirements, the worse your profitability. And you may think, okay, isn't that kind of mechanical based on the fact that depreciation expense will drive your income? Yes, but not really here, because remember, we've industry adjusted. So this is relative to your industry peers. Again, you have a penalty even at the end of 5 years of 1.4%. Okay, so now we get to the new and improved, right? The new and improved variables. So the power over suppliers, this is using the operating liability leverage. And hey, that works. You know, the more you can actually rely on your suppliers to float your operations, that's going to put you ahead of the game. And it's sustainable over the 5 years. And the spread is quite astonishing, 2.7%. When the median RNOA is 3.3 for the whole sample, that's a lot of action there. Okay, and inventory turnover, those repeated transactions, again, fairly stable, but far less dramatic than the operating liability leverage, about just under 1% difference at the end of 5 years. Okay, power over customers, a little more action there, again, fairly constant, and you get a 1.3% return over your competitors. Market share, just under 1%. Okay, here we go, the financial leverage, so the borrowing capacity. So the more capacity you have, as in the lower leverage, there over time, consistently, you get a big bang of about 2.3%. So it's important to maintain that financial flexibility. And that actually taps into some things that Keith was talking about earlier this morning, about having those cash reserves on hand, whether you can borrow them or whether you have them. And then excess funds is the net financial assets that you can liquidate at will. Again, it gets you a lot of action, 3.1%. Okay, so to conclude, I think it's important that we sort of re-examine some of our priors about traditional barriers to entry. If you consider abnormal activity within the industry, it's not really going to get you a whole lot beyond just being able to operate in the industry. But some of these other things that we can extract from our financial statements, like the operating liability leverage and like the excess funds and the borrowing capacity, seem to actually give you persistently high RNOA even after 5 years. So thank you. Any questions? Yes? Would you? Mm-hmm. Right. Survivorship is an inherent problem with this type of analyses, and the way that we thought about it was as follows. Really, we're looking for non-convergence, right? And if you have a firm that does survive and they were a low performer, they're more apt to converge. So since we're looking for non-convergence, we think that if there was a way to actually include those shorter time durations, it could actually make the results more dramatic. But it is inherent to all of these sort of over time persistence studies. I can tell you that when we make sure that there's, when there's 5 constant years, when we do a constant sample, you're basically seeing the results. But there is the caveat that, sure, leverage works, but that means that you were able to actually do all the things right to survive over those 5 years. So that is a caveat. I agree. Yes?
Question I have is, you're basically estimating sort of a competitive equilibrium situation where funds are adjusting and so are the consumers and the suppliers and everything. So I think as a forecasting exercise, that's fine, right? Because then you're just trying to see which variables may potentially help you to predict.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the, sort of the question of the paper, which is, does the competitive advantage or which competitive advantage sort of lead to higher future returns, and also in the interpretation of particular variables and what they mean, I think you have to be a bit more careful because, in essence, these are all endogenous relationships, and I'm not sure if you can say it is the supplier strength that's really driving this result when you have all these endogenous variables floating around on the right-hand side.
No, I agree. And the question was, we basically are trying to model this as almost a competitive equilibrium. But there's all of these outside factors that also interact with performance, with profitability, and with even the choices that managers can make about how to allocate resources. I guess our answer to that was we thought that if we could industry adjust to the extent that the industry is driven by the macroeconomy, we're hopefully controlling for some of that. But I agree, I think it's important to actually try and in future research do more to link the actual supplier and customer relationships together. I know, I'm not sure where Zachy is, but he's been doing some work in that area. And if you could come up with some supplier-customer pairs, I think you could, well, even Panos is going to be talking about something similar to that. I think that then you can really enrich the analysis and get away from some of these broad generalizations. This is sort of a first pass, right, to just document the existence of these elevated profitabilities. And now it's up to us to sort of come up with some additional contextual richness to the models. I completely agree. It's a great point. Sure.
I was wondering, if you look at things like power over suppliers,
Mm-hmm.
how is that actually related to this, what you call traditional factors, like economies of scale? I mean, it's quite likely that they are related, and actually that condition
Right.
to get into these relations is actually economies of scale, for instance. But that's more interesting.
So the question is, economies of scale and power over suppliers, they are related. And I agree. I think what we have hopefully done is we have decomposed the price movement, the price of the goods, which I think would be captured in economies of scale because that's actual, the aggregate price that you've paid for your goods and you're passing along to your consumers, from the actual characteristics of the transaction itself. What are the credit terms? How long do you have to pay? How frequently do you order? So we're hopefully getting away from just purely the cost, which is reflected in economies of scale, and getting at some of those other factors that we sort of take for granted. And hopefully when we're teaching MBAs and cost accounting and managerial accounting, we're saying that these things matter. And this analysis, I think, really shows that that really might be the defining factor to getting an edge over your competitors, being able to transact with your suppliers on things other than just price. I agree. Okay, thank you.